We have been thinking about that difficult practical and theoretical question as to whether the ends ever justify the means. And in that context, I mentioned a distinction between two quite different approaches to moral judgment: consequentialism and deontology. Last time we looked at consequentialism, the idea that it's only and exclusively the consequences of our action, whether those consequences are good or bad, that determines the rightness or wrongness of an action. And in particular, we looked at utilitarianism, which affirms a principle of utility which says we should always act so as to maximize human happiness or pleasure for the greatest number of people. The greatest good for the greatest number, according to utilitarianism. Now we want to look at deontological approaches. In sharp contrast with utilitarianism or any other version of consequentialism, in sharp contrast are deontological theories. Those theories claim that the rightness or wrongness of human action is not exclusively a function of the goodness or badness of the consequences. Now, if it's not exclusively a function of the goodness or badness of the consequences, what matters more? Well, from the deontological perspective, there are inherent features of actions, distinguishable from an action's consequences, that are actually relevant and maybe even more relevant to moral judgment than the consequences. Deontological theory depends upon the coherence of this distinction between inherent features and consequences. I like to think of this in terms of what happens when you throw a rock or a pebble into a body of still water, a pond. The throwing of that rock causes inherently a small splash, or maybe a large splash, depending upon the size of the rock. That splash, immediate to the impact of the rock, is like what the deontologist has in mind by the inherent features of actions. Now, of course, that throwing of the rock into the pond will cause ripples. And it's helpful, I think, to think of the consequences of our actions as all of those ripples that follow, if you will, the initial impact of the pebble in the pond. The debate between consequentialism and deontology may be understood in terms of what is considered relevant to moral judgment. For the consequentialist, it's the splash and all of those ripples extending out as far as we can possibly see or know. The deontologist wants to insist that most relevant, or at least more relevant than all those extensive ripples, is that initial impact and what we were intending to do immediately with that action that we do. For the deontologist, actions have inherent features that are distinguishable from their consequences. So shooting someone or hitting someone over the head with a baseball bat is inherently harmful. It's seriously morally problematic. It violates non-maleficence. Without regard to those long-term consequences that action might have. Similarly, to lie or to manipulate someone is seriously morally problematic. It violates the principle of autonomy. And it is seriously morally problematic independent of whatever long-term consequences that action might have. The classic deontological theorist was the German Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant was a radical deontologist. He believed that our moral judgments needed to be absolutely certain, and because consequences are not certain, they are completely irrelevant to moral judgment. So, for example, in his example of the potential murderer at the door who is seeking out the person hiding in your basement in order to kill them, he believes that we must tell that potential murderer the truth when he asks, "Is so-and-so hiding in your basement?" We know to lie would be manipulative. We don't actually know what's going to happen as a result of our telling the potential murderer the truth. Now, most deontologists are not so radical as Kant. For Kant, the ends never justify the means. Many deontologists would say, well, the ends may justify the means because consequences do matter, but they matter alongside of and not exclusively in relation to the inherent features of actions. For such deontologists, the ends don't always justify the means, but sometimes they do. Next time, we will look at the implication of our system of principles for this question of ends and means. And let me suggest to you now that it represents a moderate deontological approach, one which says the ends don't always justify the means, though sometimes they do.